Nothing was needed but to take stock, to ensure the smooth running of the empire, to make sure that the Caesar was getting all possible returns on occupied lands. So they counted the people by regional authority, by tribe and clan and family, each one recalled to their ancestral lands. They counted the people, this occupying power, to see if the revenue of empire matched the potential of the lands and people, to give glory to Caesar upon his throne, the human emperor treated as a god. Joseph had long moved from his family home in Bethlehem of Judea to Nazareth in Galilee, where they needed a carpenter, and where he could make a good living. And there he had met and gotten engaged to a woman named Mary, who was, at the time of the census, pregnant with her first child. She had told him of the circumstances of her pregnancy, which were, shall we say, incredible. But he figured if Elizabeth could have a baby miraculously well past her childbearing years, who was he to argue about Mary's child? Besides, the change in her was apparent. The strength of her voice, the way she looked him in the eye as she told her story, the words of prophecy that she shared with him when she returned from her visit to Elizabeth. Though he did not fully understand, Joseph felt and trusted the presence of the holy and promised to raise Mary's baby as his own. It was because of the baby that Mary had to go with Joseph to Bethlehem to be counted with his family, rather than remaining in Nazareth with her own. even though they were not yet married, even though they both knew that the child was his by love rather than genetics. The time of the census came late in her pregnancy, and by the time they arrived in Bethlehem, she had gone into labor. The house of David was large, of course. David himself had fathered so many children, to say nothing of his son Solomon. So Bethlehem was crowded as all of them returned. So in order to give Mary in her labor faith, the women of her fiance's family took her into a place apart, the ground floor of the house, dirt floors below the room where guests and innkeepers alike would sleep. This was the place where the family cow and the pack animals of the guests were kept safe. But it was a space where the women could attend Mary in her first birth, reassure her and guide her in privacy and relative quiet as she delivered her son. In this place where the hay made for easier cleanup, and the women swaddled her baby in their shawls and made Mary and her infant comfortable with blankets on the hay. Outside the city, shepherds tended their flocks, the ones over which they had charge, the sheep of the wealthy of Bethlehem, and they led them from hillside to graze. That night, they shared the watch around a low fire, alert for predators and wandering sheep. Out of nowhere, it seemed, radiance flared, and a shining creature appeared within the light, terrifying, its form shifting in ways that they couldn't follow, all arms and eyes and wings, impossible to describe. The messenger spoke in words that they seemed to hear with their hearts rather than their ears. Do not be afraid. I am here with good news. News that will bring joy not just to you, but to all. Tonight the Anointed One is born, down there in Bethlehem, and you will find him a swaddled newborn in a feed trough, lying in the hay. And suddenly the radiance seemed to be everywhere, all at once. It was no longer one messenger, but many, everywhere they looked, all of them singing of God's goodness and mercy and the peace that God brings. After a time, the radiance faded, and the shepherds were left as they had been, with their flocks on a hillside, woolen blankets surrounding a low fire. And they looked at each other, wondering if what they had just seen was actually real, wondering if they, mere shepherds, had truly received angelic visits? Had they somehow been found worthy? Surely this same experience had happened to everyone everywhere, to the wealthy in Bethlehem as much as to them, isolated here as they were. They sat for several minutes, asking one another, talking it through, until the only thing that made sense was to go down into the city to look for the promised child. Shocked that nobody else seemed to be doing as they were, they looked in so many stables and so many houses before they looked into the room below the inn. And they found the women still cleaning up, checking on the new mother, showing her how to latch her child, keeping an eye on the bleeding, and more subtly keeping an eye on the new father, who was nestled into the clean hay beside his beloved. Joseph and Mary, exhausted and exhilarated, cradling their baby in awe at the tiny perfection of sleepy yawns and unfocused eyes. And the shepherds, these strangers, stepped softly among the animals, amazed that no one else seemed to know or to care about the miracle before them and what the angels had said. They tried to soften the voices more accustomed to calling across windy hillsides and explain their presence to the young couple, the shining, indescribable messengers, the illumination of divine presence, the words of promise that had led them to this place. The women paused their work, listening closely, astonished at this description of the birth that they had just assisted, this birth that had seemed so normal, but for the location, but for the displacement of so many back into a Bethlehem that no longer held them easily. It was, after all, a quiet time, and they wondered at the visions that the shepherds described, the awe that could make them leave their sheep behind to search for a baby. The incredible promise that such a miracle could happen with only ordinary people in attendance. But Mary listened and remembered the glory of the one who had visited her. She felt again the upswelling in her heart of the prophecy that she had sung in the presence of Elizabeth's great belly and her own new pregnancy. It was not only her own loneliness that God had blessed, but the ordinary lives of women, of laborers. This child of the Holy Spirit was helped into the world by those who had no more voice than she ever had. He was tickled and admired and blessed by poor shepherds, their calloused hands wiping away tears as they gazed enthralled at her sleeping newborn. And in that moment, she knew that no war of the Caesar could compare with the upending of the world that was happening in her child, in these people, strangers to one another, bound together in witness to a grace greater than any of them. Mary knew that the thrones of the powerful were meaningless before the love of these ordinary people. And she knew that their hungers, all of those who had gathered that night, their hungers had been filled in the presence of her little family, while those who slept in luxurious rooms remained unaware of all that God had done. Mary listened, knowing that the shepherds who left her to go back to their sheep were not the same men who had started their nightly watch hours before. That the women who cared for her so tenderly would never forget the possibility of God being present in the tiny, fragile body that they had caught and cleaned and swaddled so carefully. Mary listened, in awe anew of the one who makes the ordinary holy, and whose love becomes visible first and foremost to those so often left out, those more valued for their usefulness than for their humanity. And she treasured all of the words of the shepherds, all of the care of the women, all of the holy presence that had surrounded her. And she snuggled her little baby closer to her heart. Thanks be to God. Amen.